These engines had a voice and they spoke and they had a personality, and if you got along with them, fine, and if you didn't, you better find another job because they were going to be more contrary than you were.
And that's true. For example, some locomotives would be considered a real sweet job. They were easy steaming, easy to run. Others would be rough riding. They'd have problems, they'd just be the problem child. And guys would prefer certain engines over others.
How many cars, automobiles, do you see that people talk about having a personality? These guys would get out and literally baby their engines. They would wash them down. They would wipe them down. They wanted the best coal. And of course they had a voice through the whistle and the bell. And they had a headlight. And it was just part of the American scene. It was black. It snorted, it grumbled, it purred, and it ran like a wildcat when necessary. It was a highly esteemed facility.
People just don't realize how important it really was and what it did. I think without the Locomotive Works, Lima would have been a completely different town.
They produced a quality there that was second to none.
The products that Lima produced are around the world and known, and still known after all these years.
Back in the early days when Ohio was first settled, Lima was in what was called the Great Black Swamp. Literally a swamp with huge amounts of forest. So as a result, lumbering became a big industry in northwestern Ohio. The first company in Lima that preceded the Locomotive Works was a small wood sash and door company that made lumber products. Later, they went out of business and they were succeeded by a company that made sawmills, farm equipment, and other agricultural implements. Well, when you make sawmills in particular, you need a boiler. So they acquired that skill. So you had ties with the lumber industry. You had the ability to make a boiler. Eventually, lumber interests moved to Michigan as land was cleared in Ohio. And eventually, one of their customers asked them to help build a locomotive to move logs from the forest to the sawmill.
Ephraim Shea came down from Harbor Springs, Michigan with his ideas for a geared steam locomotive.
He had heard about a company here in town, and he thought, okay, interesting to contact them. He contacted them about 1879, 1880. Lima started producing these Shea locomotives, and that was, of course, their beginnings in the locomotive market.
He wanted basically a boiler put on a flat car. He wanted a crankshaft with two drive shafts, one going to each set of basically freight car trucks with gearing on them. Totally radical to the concepts of railroad locomotives of that day, which we're now talking late 1870s.
Well, for the small mining ones and all this, it was a godsend, I believe, and all this. It helped to get the logs to market much easier. It was very economical that way. They could restore it. It could be up in the mountains and all this, so it had to be easy to maintain. It could operate on very poor trackage. And again, it was just a lot easier than trying, again, using horses and all this to, pull the logs and such, or floating them downstream, and you depend on the weather. And you worry about horses getting crushed or whatever and all this with the too much speed being picked up and all by said load.
So by 1885, Lima was building Shea locomotives. They were building sawmills, and they were a big producer of sawmill equipment. And they had other ancillary products that they did. But they were gradually drifting into the locomotive market, primarily because of interest in Shays, though they were building what's called conventional rod locomotives at the same time. They were building whatever the customer wanted. But it was the Shay that was starting to establish a name for Lima in the industry. Not necessarily the locomotive industry, but rather the lumber industry.
Allowed the lumbermen of northern Michigan to move into those forests in times when the ground wasn't frozen hard, so they could move the logs any time of the year, be it summer, be it winter, be it rainy, be it snowing. It didn't have to be perfect track. These engines would work on rough track and steep grades, and they would move. So it gave the industry a quantum leap forward in terms of lumber production. Well, they developed a foundry, and they started casting railroad wheels for freight cars and for the Shea engine. And that develops into a line of freight cars that they start building under their new name of Lima Machine. And mainline locomotive production starts about 1911. They had made a few locomotives for some of the short line and the smaller railroads in prior years, but it was the Erie Railroad, which ran on the north side of the plant to start with, who came in and said, "Can you make us a fleet of locomotives?" And they did at South Lima.
The Lima Locomotive Works as a company under that name appeared in 1916. And that's really when the company became a success. It wasn't immediate, but that was the turning point. That's the time that Lima was going to eventually become one of the big three builders.
We build engines. They go out to South Lima, and they've established their rod production locomotive out there. And the Shea production follows close behind in a new building that was built just to produce the Shea engines. And suddenly the guys that had one job in the morning and another job in early afternoon and a third job in the plant before the end of the shift, suddenly they're finding themselves in enlarged departments. There was a department that built just the boilers, very dangerous working conditions. There was a department that did nothing but drill metal plate. There was a department that assembled tenders. There were assembly gangs for the locomotive. There were assembly gangs for the drive rods. There were departments to machine the wheels that went under the engine, to assemble the truck sets that went under the engines and the tenders, and to do all of those specific things that were necessary to produce an end product, which was a steam locomotive.
By 1920, the Shea was pretty much an outmoded product. The lumber industry was getting a little smaller. The market just was drying up for the Shea. They were getting trucks, they were getting other things that they could do the work with. So the Shea was kind of declining. So Lima was rather fortunate they had made the move into the rod market. And as a result, they were able to prosper.
To have had a job at either the Lima Locomotive or the refinery or one of the steel foundries out there was prestigious. People still talk today that it was a city unto itself, just the South Lima area. So to have gotten a job meant that you were of the quality that was going to work and take pride in what you did.
They were proud of what they had done, and they could tell you where this was set up and that was set up, how noisy it was when they bucked rivets and in the boiler room, and how smooth and easy things went in the erecting floors. It was an interesting bunch of people to be around. I could see those steam locomotives sitting there in various stages of their construction, and because I had seen enough of the photographs from that time, and so this overhead crane would ride over that area, and I'd see all that stuff just like it was happening there. John Keller was an old railroader. He worked on the railroads. I believe he worked with the Nickel Plate Railroad. John knew the Lima locomotive very well, and John always called it steam's finest hour. And that was the era of the Lima locomotive works.